the morgue was always quiet. But tonight, it felt different, heavier. Nurse Helen breathed in, the cold air stinging her lungs. 20 years she had worked here, yet tonight fear prickled her skin. She made her rounds, checking each refrigerated drawer. John Doe, Jane Doe, each tag a stark reminder of life's fragility. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting long, eerie shadows. Helen stopped at the window, peering into the darkness beyond. The city lights blurred, a million stories she'd never know. A shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't superstitious, but something felt wrong. Terribly wrong. Turning back to her rounds, she pushed down the unease. It was just the night, she told herself, just her imagination. The first blackout was sudden, plunging the morgue into absolute darkness. The humming of the lights died, leaving a ringing silence. Helen swore under her breath, fumbling for her flashlight. It flickered to life, a weak beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air, already cold, seemed to drop a few degrees. Fear, sharp and cold, gripped her heart. As she moved towards the fuse box, a sound stopped her, a soft, shuffling sound, coming from the direction of the drawers. Helen froze, her blood turning to ice. She shone her light down the rows of metal drawers. Nothing. But the shuffling sound came again, closer this time. The whispers started with the second blackout. Faint at first, like the rustling of dead leaves, they swirled around her, cold and menacing. Her flashlight beam danced wildly, revealing nothing but the cold steel surfaces of the morgue. "Hello?" Her voice echoed in the darkness, thin and brittle. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Panic welled up inside her, choking her breath. She had to get out to get help, but the whispers held her captive, their icy breath caressing her ear. Just her imagination, she thought desperately. It had to be. But deep inside, a primal fear told her otherwise. With the third blackout, the shadows came alive. Helen, her back pressed against a wall, watched in terror as the darkness seemed to writhe and pulse. Shapes formed in the shadows, grotesque and distorted, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. A cold hand brushed her cheek, sending a scream dying into her throat. She kicked out, her foot connecting with something solid. A thud, followed by a low growl, sent shivers down her spine. She was trapped, surrounded by what? The shadows danced closer, their forms becoming clearer. Their faces, twisted in silent screams, reached for her, their fingers long and skeletal. Helen squeezed her eyes shut, her heart pounding against her ribs. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a waking nightmare. A flicker of light caught her eye. Her flashlight, dropped in her panic, had rolled to the window, its beam illuminating the darkness outside. And there, staring in at her with empty eyes, was a face. It was a man's face, pale and gaunt, his features frozen in a grotesque mockery of peace. His eyes, though, were wide open, staring directly at her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. Helen stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The face in the window remained, its gaze unwavering. It was one of them, one of the faces she had seen in the drawers. But how? The face suddenly contorted in a silent snarl, its lips pulling back from decaying teeth. Helen screamed, a primal sound of terror that echoed through the empty morgue. The lights flickered, then surged back to life, bathing the morgue in its usual sterile glow. The shadows retreated, the whispers died, and the face in the window vanished. Helen lay huddled on the floor, her chest heaving, her body trembling uncontrollably. It had been a hallucination. It had to be. There was no other explanation, but the terror that gripped her was all too real. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky beneath her. The morgue seemed different now, menacing, filled with unseen horrors. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every whisper a promise of terror. She had to get out, now. As she fumbled with the lock on the door, the lights went out again. This time, the darkness was absolute, suffocating, and the cold, it was unbearable, seeping into her bones, chilling her to the core. Panic clawed at her throat, threatening to consume her. She pounded on the door, her cries for help swallowed by the oppressive silence. She was trapped. The shuffling sounds returned, closer this time, accompanied by the rasping whispers that sent chills down her spine. Something brushed against her leg, cold and clammy. Helen kicked out wildly, her scream echoing in the darkness. The touch retreated, but the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like vultures circling their prey. Then she saw it, a faint glow emanating from the end of the hallway. It pulsed with an eerie light, beckoning her forward. Hope, fragile and uncertain, flickered within her. Cautiously, she moved towards the light, her hand outstretched, feeling her way through the darkness. The whispers followed, their icy breath on her neck, but she pressed on. As she neared the glow, she saw what it was. A single figure, silhouetted against the light. It was a man, tall and imposing, his back to her. He was bleeding, blood seeped from a wound in his side, staining his white coat crimson. But the dead don't bleed. The first rays of dawn pierced through the window as the door to the morgue swung open. Police officers, their faces grim, rushed in, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found Nurse Helen huddled in a corner, her eyes wide and unseeing, her body racked with silent sobs. The morgue was empty, except for the rows of refrigerated drawers, their cold steel reflecting the pale light of dawn. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of what had transpired that night. Just a lone nurse, driven to the brink of madness by the terrors of the night. As they led her away, her gaze passed over the refrigerated drawers, her eyes widening in horror. On the floor, a single white rose lay wilting, its petals stained with something dark and viscous. The dead, it seemed, had a story to tell, but who would dare listen?